Welcome everybody to AE911Truth Webinars. I'm Richard Gage and I am an architect with AE911Truth, founder. 10 years ago now we've founded AE911Truth. I'm a member of the American Institute of Architects, 28 years in the technical and building industries, and I'm joined by none other than Freefall's Andy Steele. Hi, Andy.
Hey, Richard. Thanks for having me on and for doing this webinar today. I want to remind everybody, as always, that YouTube defaults to a low resolution. So if you want to see the slides in a higher resolution, just click the gearbox beneath the video screen, select 720 HD resolution. And like always, we're going to be taking questions related to the information presented today in this particular webinar. If you have questions about other aspects of the 9/11 controlled demolition evidence, and they're covered under other subjects, then wait for those webinars to come around. And we do welcome all questions. You can submit them simply by typing them into the question box at the bottom of the screen. Back to you, Richard.
Thanks, Andy. And by the way, don't let me forget to tell our listeners that we have an exciting version tonight of Freefall. Shall we? Well, I'll make a note of that, Andy. So the radio show tonight is particularly good. I'll just give you a hint. Sham Sunder. For some of you, that name rings a bell in the annals of infamy as the lead investigator at NIST for the NIST report for the Twin Towers and Building 7. Today on this webinar, we're talking about the Twin Towers. And we found an old interview, relatively unknown, with Sham Sunder on No Lies Radio. It's actually quite insightful. Andy, any more you want to say about that before we get going here?
It's an interview that Alan Reese, the producer of the station, did with Sham Sunder back in 2008, just as the report was released. So I'll be playing that in tonight's Freefall episode and offering my commentary on that. And then Alan's going to be on later episodes to talk about that. What
time is that?
That is 10 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Pacific. You can find out more about that by following AE911Truth's Facebook page. There'll be an announcement.
Great. But the most exciting thing is that today we are going to be talking about the Twin Towers. Last week, we finished up with the two-part series on Building 7. This week, we're launching into the explosive nature of the Twin Towers. And just so you know something about me, I've been an architect, as I mentioned, 28 years, and I've worked on these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums, the construction administration for this $125 million high school, and more recently, this $100 million project near Las Vegas with 1,200 tons of steel framing and retail, mid-rise office space, and parking structure. And I'm joined by more than 2,700 now architects and engineers as a result of our successful effort at the American Institute of Architects National Convention, where we signed up 150 more, mostly AIA members. When they see the evidence that you're going to see, they sign our petition. And that's been true for 500, almost 600. Gosh, we just completed a southwestern, northwestern, and southeastern U.S. tour of the firefighters, architects, engineers for 9/11Truth. And we've been, so that's another 70 presentations in the last year and a half, including Europe. And in those presentations, a show of hands yields that 98%, usually 100% of the people no longer believe the official story. All of them often are moved from their position of believing the official story to unsure. A few of them are unsure. Most of them agree with the evidence for controlled demolition. A lot of them sign our petition. Why? Because we have the evidence, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, the explosive evidence. Next week, we'll be talking about the extreme heat, the evidence of extreme heat and incendiaries. This week, we're going to be focusing on the witnesses of explosions, sudden near freefall collapse, high velocity lateral ejections, shattering of the steel frame, the midair pulverization of concrete in the towers, none of which, of course, can be created by office fires. And so let's just take a look at the design of this building, because some people loved it, some people hated it. These twin towers. Gigantic dumbness, says Robert Stern. And Minoru Yamasaki, the architect, was praised, though, initially by the sculptural purity of his forms. Well, I'm going to leave that up to you. What I want to note is that I appreciated personally more the tallest skyscraper in the world, which had a beautiful unfolding mass design, real design in the architectural sense, as opposed to extruding two squares until they become the tallest buildings in the world. That's one of the reasons a lot of people hated them. But no matter how you feel about the design of the Twin Towers, most people appreciated the technical innovation, because engineering wise, you had a forest of columns in these buildings. Every 20 or 30 feet was a column. But what in the Twin Towers, they moved the columns out to the exterior and grouped the interior columns inside of those. 47 massive core columns in the center. On the outside, as you see, groups of 30-foot tall columns with welded to horizontal spandrel panels, and those were in turn bolted all around. Inside, you had almost solid steel at the base of the towers. Between these two groups of columns was laid these floor panels, lightweight steel trusses, and concrete flooring, which spanned 60 feet on one side, two sides of the Twin Towers. That's extraordinary. What did that yield? 60 feet of open office planning. You don't have to plan the furniture around these, all of this forest of columns anymore. It's extraordinary. Take a look. Wide open spaces. First time in skyscraper history in the early 70s, and this started being inhabited, occupied. But tenants were rather quickly disenfranchised with the low 9-foot ceilings, the marching columns around the outside, which felt to some like a prison cell, especially when compared to the 80s, when you had these large picturesque windows. And that was quite a stark contrast. So by some, according to some researchers, the towers were only half occupied at the time of 9/11, which is very interesting, because it could have given access, a much easier access to some of the placement of these explosives, which we're going to be talking about today. But even more interestingly, why would these towers be purchased in private hands 6 weeks prior to 9/11, when the city was requiring them to be abated? The asbestos was required to be abated because of federal regulations. So the Port Authority didn't do it, transferred it into private hands, and with a $5 billion project requiring massive retrofits, and also the only half occupied. It doesn't make financial sense. But we don't speculate about those matters, but it's just interesting to keep in the back of our mind as we realize how solidly constructed these buildings were. I mean, this is 100,000 tons of structural steel. What steel does in a fire is it conducts that heat rapidly throughout its system. It's a massive heat sink. So any source of 1,000-degree fires, or NIST claims 1,800-degree fires, would be rapidly conducted throughout the system. And that's the reason that fires don't collapse steel frame skyscrapers. The other reason is that they're fireproofed. Now, these buildings were, of course, fireproofed as well. But NIST claims that the fireproofing was knocked off of particularly the lightweight steel trusses. We'll come back to that. As we examine first, what happened in that morning? How did this official story develop?
On September 11th, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken radically off course. Within an hour, 2 of the planes had flown into the enormous steel towers of the World Trade Center, creating fires and eventually toppling them. Dazed by the news, the American public soon believed the fires in the towers had burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the buildings to give way. A myth developed, fed by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience. Elements of the myth. The impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, steel melting, the buildings failing and suddenly imploding. In a mere 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust. Right at the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just scream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
The myth bled into the FEMA report and was echoed by the experts.
It was the combination of the impact load doing great damage to the building, followed by the fire that caused collapse.
Well, here's the official story in a nutshell. It began that morning from the gentleman on the street, interestingly enough. We'll come back to that. What we want to look at, though, is that true? What else could be true? Well, in the West, we use the scientific method. We've had it for 100 years or so. And we formulate a question, pretty obvious. How did the towers come down? We do some background research. How have other towers come down? We make some observations. We construct a hypothesis. That's our best guess as to how these towers came down. And we make some predictions based on those hypotheses. Well, if they came down this way, then such and such might be true. Well, we test those predictions with experiments, and we get a pretty objective, scientific analysis going from which we can draw conclusions. We don't focus on our favorite hypothesis. We don't exclude other rational hypotheses. We test them all. And if the hypothesis is corroborated, we go back, we report the results in an open, transparent manner. We don't say to those hoping to look inside of our computer input data, and we don't say, I'm sorry, we can't give that to you. It might jeopardize public safety. Well, that's exactly what NIST did upon receiving our FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act of America, Freedom of Information Act. And we don't say, you can't have it, it's a black box. Well, that's not transparency. We're going to be looking at lots of non-transparent actions on the part of NIST that comprise a cover-up, in our opinion. And we'll be showing you evidence of that. The hypothesis is not corroborated, as in the case that you'll see, NIST. We go back and we construct a hypothesis that stands a better chance against the data, against the experiments until we have an internally consistent self-corroborating set of data. Now, what we're going to be noticing here is that we did have some earlier investigations. The American Society of Civil Engineers put forth some volunteers. Well, these are not your typical volunteers. They had $100,000 contracts with the federal government, a minimum. FEMA came in, but who is this, an independent report? No. We'll see that these original volunteers worked their way all the way through the FEMA and the NIST report. And we're going to be focusing on the 2005 NIST report. $20 million in funding, 10,000 pages, 3 years. We'll see what they came up with. But it is interesting to note that early on, most of these same characters worked their way through all of the investigations, and including providing the assistance that popular mechanics used to try to discredit the 9/11 Truth movement, and not even mentioning in their latest book about, at the time we had 1,000 architects and engineers calling for a new investigation. They actually said there were none, which was not true, of course. We now have 2,700, as I mentioned. In week 1, we looked carefully at the 10 key characteristic features of controlled demolition. So I want to refer you back to week 1 if you haven't seen it already, and week 2 for that matter, so that you can get a good foundation. Now, those archives are available on our website. You can click on them and see them. But with respect to the Twin Towers, we'll be looking at direct evidence of explosive destruction this week. A fire can't create any one of these key characteristics. What are they? Sudden onset of destruction. Fires don't do that. Straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint. Fires don't do that. Removing column supports is the only way that can happen. All at once, fraction of a second, split second timing. Fire, an organic process, can't do that. A near free fall acceleration straight down through the path of greatest resistance. Fire can't do that. Resulting in the total dismemberment of the steel structure for loading and shipment. Fire doesn't do that. Minimal damage to adjacent structures. Well, sometimes fire can do that, but often other structures are burned down as well. Sounds and flashes of explosives heard and seen by hundreds of witnesses in the case of the Twin Towers, which we'll be looking at today. Fires don't do that. Enormous clouds of pulverized concrete. Fires don't pulverize concrete in midair. Isolated explosive ejections, visible here, there, everywhere, obviously in an engineered pattern. Fires don't do that. Chemical evidence of cutter charges, for goodness sakes. We'll be looking at that next week. Fires don't do that. So you can begin to see that in our objective view of what fires can do and can't do, what explosives can and can't do, is going to be fairly straightforward, especially when we have government documentation, experts agreeing, those who aren't compromised or biased by existing federal contracts, who might not want to bite the hand that feeds them, foreknowledge of the destruction. These explosive demolitions take months of planning and engineering. People know about it. We saw last week, hey, the building's going to blow up, and referring to Building 7. Well, all this is proof of controlled demolition, which we're going to be looking at as we proceed here. Now, NIST says that, hey, these raging fires up near the point of jet plane impacts weakened particularly the lightweight steel trusses from which the fireproofing was knocked off by the impact of the airplane. That's a theory. This theory has all kinds of holes, by the way. First of all, the fires were just about out in the case of the South Tower particularly. They weren't raging. when witnesses heard explosions, when we saw the inward bowing of the columns, which you see here, which NIST blames on the sagging trusses. But these lightweight trusses sagging cannot cause the inward bowing of these massive 14-inch square steel tube columns marching every 3 feet 4 inches around the building. So what does NIST do? They impose a lateral load in their computer model of 5,000 pounds laterally to buckle those columns. And indeed, in their computer model, the mass above the point of jet plane impacts then drives the rest of the building down. And their theory is that it drove the building down to the ground in 12 seconds, by the way, or less, and then destroyed itself. That's what we're going to be looking at today. So we're looking at the evidence of explosive destruction. We're not going to be arguing with structural engineers or fire protection engineers or anybody else about what fire can or can't do to a building, because it's irrelevant for the purposes of demonstrating the explosive destruction of this building. But we want you to have an understanding of our disagreement with the initial NIST report and its theory of column failure. Do we have a sudden onset of destruction? Now, this isn't at the base of the structure, but at the point of jet plane impacts. And why? Well, we'll be looking for what causes that, of course. Sounds of explosions heard by witnesses, flashes of light seen by witnesses. But this is a magic show. We're being deceived here. That's what you're going to see, that our mind has been shown on TV, these massive explosions with airplanes. But, you know, it's a 45 minutes to 90 minutes later that these towers come down after witnesses hear explosions, which you're going to be seeing. They want us to associate the planes with the destruction of these towers and the fires. But what we're seeing and hearing, hundreds of witnesses, so that's what we're going to be looking at right now, is something else altogether, something up the sleeve. And the city kept this sleeve hidden until August of 2005, when the city fire commissioner, his accounts, the oral histories, 500 firefighters, first responders, their testimony orally recorded was released finally because the court ordered to the New York Times the release by the city of these FDNY oral histories. And here it is, all of them, the testimony. And well, somebody went through this, Graham McQueen in Canada, found that 118 of them, now he's got 156 firefighters observing flashes of light, sounds of explosions, some of them being blown around inside the buildings, many of them being killed. Not the ones, of course, who recorded their testimony later. We felt the ground shake. You could see the tower sway, and then it just came down. All of a sudden, the ground just started shaking. Felt like a train under my feet. Why is the ground shaking more than 1,000 feet down below what we're told is a gravitational collapse initiation? It shook my bones. Shortly before the first tower came down, I remember feeling the ground shaking. So they're feeling these, as you'll see, explosions. Heard a terrible noise, and then debris just started flying everywhere. That order is very important. Think about this. It's not they see the building beginning to collapse and the collapse is causing the ground to shake. The ground shakes, and then the debris starts flying, and then the building starts coming down. Very important. Wasn't one explosion in the South Tower, one floor under another. Figured it was a bomb because it looked like a synchronized, deliberate kind of thing. This theme comes up again and again. Seemed like on television when they blow up these buildings, seemed like it was going all the way around like a belt. All these explosions. These are highly trained, seasoned firefighters we're listening to. Let's see what they're talking about. Here's the North Tower on the right, a known controlled demolition on the left. We're looking at a lot of similarity here. We think enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, particularly this one on the left, slowing it down. And particularly since no fire has ever brought down a skyscraper in the 100-year history of skyscrapers. Shouldn't it have been explosions? The first hypothesis that NIST looked at, they never seriously looked at that hypothesis. Doesn't make sense to us. Us being 2,700 architects and engineers, 20,000 others, and millions in the 9/11 Truth movement worldwide. Somewhere around the middle of the World Trade Center, there was this orange and red flash coming out. Initially, it was just one flash. Then this flash just kept popping all the way around the building, and that building has started to explode. Well, people, this is what controlled demolitions do. This is not what fires do. Let's look at the South Tower. Any similarity to the known controlled demolition? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Yeah, especially since it started 2 major wars in which a couple of million people have been killed, including 7,000 US soldiers. Especially since we have a $4.5 trillion global war on terror that was started as a result of these events. And the other 2 airlines, Shanksville and Pentagon, that David Ray Griffin spends such quality time reviewing, but which is beyond the scope of AE911Truth. I thought the terrorists planted explosives somewhere in the building. That's how loud it was, a crackling explosive. Let's listen to these other witnesses.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
The whole building just collapsed on us inside the lobby. Was that a secondary explosion? Yes, it was.
That was the...
Yeah, definitely a secondary explosion.
I heard a second explosion and another rumble.
An hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower.
It just went boom, it was like a bomb went off. And another explosion came right from it, just everyone flying.
There were numerous secondary explosions taking place in that building. There were continuous explosions.
No, the first explosion, and there was a second explosion in the same building. There were 2 explosions.
Okay.
Federal agencies that were down there do believe that there was some sort of explosive device somewhere else besides the planes hitting.
There was another explosion that took place in one of the towers here. So obviously, according to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
There was a secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before or on the aircraft that did not explode until an hour later.
Then there was no secondary explosions and then subsequent collapses.
That the FBI most likely thinks that there was a car or truck packed with explosives underneath the buildings, which also exploded at the same time and brought both of them down.
Now, that's the first time we're hearing that. So 2 planes and explosives that were in the building. Is that correct?
That is the working theory at this point. That
It sounded like gunfire. You know, bang, 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 bang. And then all of a sudden, 3 big explosions.
About 50 consecutive bangs, and it fell down like a waterfall.
And we heard the noise associated with an implosion.
We heard a very loud blast explosion. We looked up, and the building literally began to collapse before us.
We heard a loud explosion, and at that point, building 2 was collapsing.
At that point, we heard a loud boom. I looked up and just saw the building coming at us.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse? To me, it sounded like an explosion was another major explosion. The building itself, literally the top of it came down.
All of a sudden you hear explosion, and then you can see the building starting to collapse.
Huge explosion that we all heard and felt.
We understand now there has been a secondary explosion on Tower 2.
According to the Associated Press, another building that has either been attacked or exploded.
The tower, rather, that has collapsed, and we are told collapsed because of a third explosion.
And about an hour later after that, there was a huge explosion at the base of the South Tower. That's One World Trade Center, and part of the building collapsed.
We could hear a rumble, which was about 5 seconds long, preceding the actual collapse, and then a boom when each of those towers collapsed.
Just seconds ago, there was a huge explosion, and it appears right now the Second World Trade Tower has just collapsed.
I was about 5 blocks away when I heard explosions.
And then you heard from far away, boom, boom. And you heard the boom, 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 boom.
It was like if they had detonated.
Detonated.
To take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
From the corner, boom, 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 boom. Just like 20 straight hits. And as the bombs were going, people just started running. And I sat there and watched a few of them explode, and it just started going pop. It just started going boom, 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 boom. And he goes, how fast? I go, like firecrackers.
Well, this is not reported by NIST. Not one of these witnesses, all of which are quite credible, of explosions. They say they interviewed 1,000 people. Well, I'm sure they did interview some of these people, but for some reason, this testimony does not appear in the final report. Do we think this testimony is important? Do we think it's critical? Do we think it's part of what happened and needs to be documented? It can only be what amounts to a cover-up on the part of NIST that it is not in the final report. Well, NIST says it couldn't have been an explosion or explosives because explosive demolitions start from the bottom. Well, let's listen to Mark Loiseau.
You can go almost anywhere in the structure, and given the right circumstances, you can release all of that stored energy, converting it into what is called kinetic energy. That's energy in motion, and that's what brings the building down.
Top down. So indeed, you can have top-down controlled demolitions. In fact, NIST actually claims that this top portion, in the case of the North Tower here, drove the rest of the building down to the ground and then destroyed itself. But what we're going to do is apply what we learned in the 7th grade physics. Let's run a Mack truck into a Volkswagen. Well, Newton's third law of motion says that the Mack truck will destroy the Volkswagen. Why? Because the heavier, stronger mass in an equal and opposite reaction, destructive force, engages. So, and it doesn't matter if we drop the Volkswagen on the Mack truck. No, we still have equal and opposite reactions. The top lightest part of a structure cannot possibly destroy the heavier, intact, cold, hard steel below. Now, that's exactly what we do see. The Volkswagen, in this case, the top part of the structure is destroying itself in the first 4 seconds. What you see is the lighter part destroying itself. Let's take a closer look here. You can see it is telescoping down, similar to Building 7 that we saw in weeks 1 and 2. It is destroying itself. The question is, what is destroying it? Is it destroying in a gravitational collapse, or is something else destroying it? We'll be taking a look at that something else, which corroborates, in fact, the testimony of the first responders about what's destroying it. They say, like a belt, all these explosions start, stop. You see, just like the first responder said, start, stop. Bands of explosions wrapping around the building. In fact, does anybody see a pile driver at the top of either tower driving the rest of the building down. No, it's been destroyed, as you just saw in the first 4 seconds. There's nothing after that left to drive the rest of the building down. We see something else, in fact, after the first 4 seconds, more like a volcano in the Tongan Sea, upward, outward, arching streamers, a geometry of fireworks, laterally freely flying structural steel sections trailed by thick white smoke clouds. We'll be looking at those very carefully next week. Is it a collapse or is it an explosion? Use your intuition. We are told it's an orange, but it looks like an apple. We have a strong faith in what we're told by experts, so-called experts, the media, the government. But something else is going on here, shattering the structure from top to bottom. Let's look at the South Tower. It falls over. It begins to fall over. It's actually falling at 22 degrees. So we have asymmetrical loading from this section that's falling off the top of the tower, or should, but doesn't, which we'll take a look at the causes of soon. We have asymmetrical damage from the fires. We have asymmetrical or non-symmetrical damage from the impacts of the airplanes. So with all this asymmetry going on, wouldn't we expect the building to fall non-symmetrically? But look from below. Just like the firefighters described, bands of explosions from top to bottom, symmetrically traveling at near free fall acceleration, straight down through the path of what should have been the greatest resistance, the thousands of tons, 80,000 tons in this case, of cold, hard, intact structural steel below. And take a look as we zoom in on those explosions. Are we seeing a gravitational pancaking collapse, or are we seeing a series of explosions? You decide. Either way, it's completely shattering the structure from top to bottom in under a dozen seconds. Nearly every column and beam dissociated from every other one. As you see here in this evidence of deeply reddened and oxidized, concave on one side, convex on the other, indicating a side concussive blast on the columns. Fires don't do this to steel. And they don't do this, the noodling of these steel beams. Extreme heat, thousands of degrees, is what causes that phenomena. Well, is the building coming straight down, symmetrical, progression? In this case, outside the footprint, contrasting that to building 7, a nice neat implosion. Well, the tower is 200 feet wide, but the debris is out to 12 or 1,400 feet diameter outside the perimeter structure footprint of the building, completely destroying the winter gardens to the west. 600 feet away, as you see here, well beyond the boundaries of the site, the World Trade Center site. Compare that to the nice, neat pile of Building 7. Something very different happened to the Twin Towers. Well, let's look at what that might be as we look for isolated explosive ejections occurring here and here and here, as the folks from Loose Change 9/11 film seen by 20 million Americans, they document quite well these isolated explosive ejections occurring up to 60 stories down below this so-called gravitational collapse. These are highly engineered, obviously, by their placement in many cases right in the middle of the towers. NIST says these are puffs of air being produced by that pile driver. Well, you see that pile driver destroying itself. It's not available to compress air after the first 4 seconds. And these are not puffs of air. They're pulverized building materials. You can see the solids in these buildings. They're occurring at 200 feet per second. Yes, physics professionals have clocked it. And here you see, out of the left side of this video, over and over again, dozens of simultaneously released isolated explosions disintegrating the upper part of this south tower. Fires don't do this. Let's listen to David Chandler, physics teacher.
As the south tower begins to explode, we track 2 squibs near the bottom of the frame. They shoot out quickly at first, then slow and merge in with the rest of the dust cloud. Using the first few data points, we see the first squib shoots out at 44.98 meters per second, or about 100 miles per hour. Doing the same for the second squib, we get a speed of 56.3 meters per second, which works out closer to 126 miles per hour.
These are speeds propelled by explosives, not puffs of air, or not air pressure. Besides, if air pressure, as NIST claims, is what's responsible for these, you'd expect that air pressure to be driven down the elevator shaft, presumably by this pile driver, which is non-existent, but were it existent, it would fill this large open office space with air pressure and blow out maybe all of these windows, or none of them, but not these geometrically precise, violent ejections occurring in the middle of the facades, as you see here. Well, how fast does the building come down? Let's take a look. Well, that's about a dozen seconds. It's completely shattered. What does that mean? Let's listen to David Chandler again.
We are here tracking the motion of the roof line at 0.2 second intervals through approximately 32 meters, or 8 stories. This graph shows the height of the roof line as a function of time. The analysis is simpler if we plot velocity as a function of time. On this kind of a graph, a straight line indicates constant acceleration. First, note that there is a sudden onset of collapse, as the point we are tracking makes a sudden transition from being at rest to an approximately constant downward acceleration. The slope of the graph indicates that the acceleration is 6.31 meters per second squared downward, which is 64% of free fall. In other words, once it starts falling, the upward resistive force is only 36% of the weight of the falling section of the building. So far, so good. But now turn it around. Newton's third law says interactions between objects work both ways. The forces 2 objects exert on each other are always equal and opposite. If the upward force acting on the falling block is 36% of the weight of the falling block, the downward force exerted by the falling block must be exactly the same, 36% of the weight of the falling block. In other words, the top section of the building is exerting less force on the lower, stronger, undamaged structure than it would if it were simply sitting motionless. Therefore, as long as the top section of the building is in uniform downward acceleration, it cannot possibly be providing sufficient force to destroy the building.
Well, that's pretty important analysis. This is pretty basic physics, actually. What is destroying it? And how much of it is being destroyed? Look at there's more steel in this building than glass. This is a tremendously strong exterior perimeter structural steel section, because it's designed to take the lateral forces of hurricanes in what is designed here as a Verandil truss, or perpendicular truss elements, which resist a lateral load and as a result are 20 times stronger in carrying the live load of the building than they needed to be, because they're over designed for that purpose because of the wind resistance requirement. So how did all of this steel collapse as if it weren't even there? This is not accounted for. Let's look at this another way. Let's take a 15-story section of Twin Towers and hold it up magically by this large crane, and for a moment. And underneath one, we're going to put nothing, just air. Underneath the other, we're going to put a similarly designed heavier building with 80,000 tons of structural steel designed to resist that load. In fact, 5 times stronger than it needed to be to resist the dead load of that building. We're going to drop these masses all at once. Now, what do you think is going to happen? On the left, we're going to meet resistance, right? This is 7th grade physics. Once again, we know intuitively that that structure is not going to come down probably at all. But if it does, it's got to crush. It's got to spend energy crushing columns, which is going to slow it down. Compared to the right, it's going to fall at free fall acceleration with no resistance under it. Well, NIST claims, in effect, that they hit the ground at the same time, virtually, almost, slowing down only a tiny, tiny, tiny bit. It's accelerating. It's actually not slowing down. It's accelerating, as David Chandler just said, at 66% of free fall acceleration. Nothing is slowing it down. It's still going faster and faster, straight down to the path of greatest resistance. That can't happen unless something else happens. Let's take a look at what more likely would have happened with Massimo Mazzucco's New Pearl Harbor video. He's included an animation, which is excellent.
Something of this kind is what we should have seen when the top section of the towers collapsed onto the lower one. The upper and lower sections should have mutually destroyed each other until all the energy is dissipated and the system comes to a rest. Alternatively, as shown in this experiment with 2 towers made of snow, the top section could have fallen off to the side after the initial collapse. What could not have happened is this.
A little tiny chunk of the building can't possibly fall and crush the entire structure below it.
This is such a simple, fundamental concept that architects and engineers were astonished in seeing it totally ignored by NIST.
This is high school physics, and our whole society is being led to believe that these fundamental laws of physics, hard science, don't apply anymore.
Yeah, this is a problem. This is why you have 2,700 architects and engineers talking to the community, trying to wake them up like we have been at the national conventions, like we are going to Mobile, Alabama, where the Alabama AIA is assembled to receive a lot of different educational information. Along with such, we'll be receiving the truth about what happened to Building 7 and the Twin Towers this early July. So we're very excited to go to present. We got a lot of support there actually in Alabama with local AIA officials. So we're going to be going to AIA conventions all over the country. This is why we need you, by the way, to support the the architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. And we'll talk about opportunities for you to do just that. But this has been documented also by in peer-reviewed papers, in this case, Tony Zambodi and others, misunderstandings in the International Journal of Protective Structures. We have the total dismemberment of the steel structure. Well, yeah, completely dismembered all the way down to the ground, one beam from another column, well outside the footprint of these buildings, as we mentioned, broken up into 30-foot lengths What about the lateral ejection of these structural steel sections? Take a look at these sections, all of which are freely flying. This is not a banana peeling off the side of the Twin Towers. These are freely flying structural steel sections. And of particular note, they're going 300 to 600 feet in every direction. This particular one here, right here, is traveling laterally, followed by thick white smoke clouds, which we'll look at next week, but is traveling laterally back to 3, forward to 3, back to 3, forward to 3. What's causing it to go laterally? Gravity, and a gravitational collapse, works down. This is a 4-ton structural steel section that takes enough energy to send a 200-pound cannonball 3 miles. This is an explosive force. Speaking of explosive forces, would we not expect in a gravitational collapse a pile of floors, like 110 of them at the bottom of each of these towers? But we only seem to have none. On the right, we have a gravitational collapse, a pancaking collapse. We have floors that are certainly crushed, but are visible. On the left, a 2-story pile of columns, beams, miscellaneous metal. Where are the concrete floors? Maybe we expect 50 of them. I'd like to see 10. We don't see any in the photographs and videos. It's been crushed. What crushed 90,000 tons of concrete in each of these towers? Where is the concrete? Well, here it is, being pulverized in midair. Completely pulverized, not crushed at the bottom after it hits the ground and breaks. No, it is being crushed, pulverized in midair, along with the 110 acres of steel decking in which this wet concrete was poured when the buildings were built. This steel decking is missing too. It's not stacked up at the bottom. It's actually found in file fragments, filings, small metal filings, galvanized steel, which you can see in the dust. I've seen it myself in the dust samples. 90,000 tons turned to 100 micron particles. This is powder. So when people say dust, this is not concrete dust. This is laid like a river, like a blanket across lower Manhattan, 3 square miles. This is powdered concrete, backed up to 30% by the analysis of the USGS and others, finds that 30% of the weight of this material is concrete and gypsum board. Let's listen to the governor.
And you see, and there's no concrete. There's very little concrete. All you see is aluminum and steel. What happened to the concrete? Was pulverized. And I was down here Tuesday, and it was like you're on a foreign planet. All of lower Manhattan, not just this site, from river to river, there was dust, powder, 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized.
Wow. That's helpful information.
What I expected to see was nothing like what I actually did see at the time of my arrival at the site. There wasn't much that you could say, you could describe. Everything was dust and metal. There was no typewriters, there was no chairs, there was no nothing.
Well, there were file cabinets, probably about 10,000 of them. This is the only one that they could find. It survived because it was in the basement. What happened to 10,000 file cabinets? What happened to all of the desks, chairs, computers? What happened to the 24 electrical transformers, which are missing? What happened to the people?
In April 2006, New Yorkers were distressed to learn that bone fragments, human remains from 9/11, had been found on the roof of the nearby Deutsche Bank building.
And how in God's name did those fragments get there?
And bone fragments less than a centimeter long. How could they be so small?
Wait a minute. We have 700 bone fragments found on top of this Deutsche Bank building over here, a half an inch long. They didn't come from the people in this plane because it sent its ejections out the other way. They didn't come from the people in the plane that hit the North Tower because the South Tower blocks it from hitting from landing its fragments on the Deutsche Bank building. Let's look at this. There were 2,749 victims altogether in the towers, according to the official numbers. Only 300 whole bodies were found, though. 20,000 pieces of bodies were found. Now, those are the ones that were found. 6,000 of them were small enough to fit into a test tube. 6,000 pieces of body small enough to fit into a test tube. 200 pieces matched to one single person. Think about this. And yet, more than 1,151 victims remain completely unaccounted for, vaporized. What can do that? In a gravitational collapse, we would expect those bodies to be trapped between layers of floors and certainly mangled, dismembered maybe, but distributed more than 800 feet in every direction, according to the map here from the victim tracking database of the FDNY. People found up to 1,000 pieces of people found 1,000 feet away from the towers. Can gravitational collapse cause such body pulverization and distribution? We believe that we've made a case here supporting the hypothesis of explosive demolition. We believe that we've shown so far the first 8 key characteristics of conventional and unconventional features of controlled demolition. Next week, of course, we'll get to features 9 and 10, focusing in on extreme temperatures and evidence of incendiaries. But so far, this is direct evidence of explosive destruction. Fire can't create any one of these, we believe, let alone all of them. With additional corroborating, circumstantial, eyewitness testimony, video testimony, data from the FEMA and NIST reports, evidence of foreknowledge, which we talked about last week in the case of Building 7. That's all proof of controlled demolition, proof beyond a reasonable doubt. What do you think? What are your remaining questions? Think about that, because you're going to have an opportunity to talk to us. But first, I want to show you that if you believe that you've seen evidence of explosive demolition, then there's a requirement on your part, I imagine, like my own and millions of people in the 9/11 Truth movement, to do something about it. Well, what can you do? You can sign our petition. You can become a member right on our website, AE911Truth.org. You can donate. And we have 2,000 members that give as little as $2.50 a month, and $10 or $25 a month, some of them. This supports us. This keeps us doing the valuable work, like I mentioned, going to the AIA conventions. You can support that project. Send us to the 12 AIA conventions between now and the next AIA national convention, where we bring up yet again the resolution calling for a new investigation that the AIA will have to make once we reach 51%. Well, last year we got 3%. This year we tripled that, more than 11%. Next year we're going to get 20 to 30%. That's why we need you to send us to the state and regional conventions between now and next year's annual convention. But let's say that you want to do something, but you don't have the resources to support us, but you have time. Well, you can help us. There's a lot of things we have to do, and Andy's here to tell us about those things.
Absolutely, Richard. It's the simplest thing that you can do. We have a lot of interesting and fun volunteer opportunities. If you're moved by this evidence, if you know other people need to hear about it, then we want you to go to the top of this webpage that you're watching this webinar on, AE911Truth.org, and then you can help by clicking the tab at the very top, fill out the volunteer form. We will get in touch with you. We need people to do outreach. We need writers, all sorts of people. If you have a talent, we can use it. So please volunteer, and we'll be in touch with you.
Fantastic. And guess what else? You can contact your elected representatives in television, radio, newspaper, media. Because why? A lot of these letters to the editor, etc., get through. You can tell friends that don't know, colleagues that don't know, family members that don't know. You can email them the website, AE911Truth.org, to everybody you can find, particularly architects and engineers. And, don't say, hey, I've got this strange theory. And it does seem strange to a lot of people. We truly recognize that this is not an easily digestible set of evidence, because the implications are quite disturbing to most people who come across it for the first or second or third time. It takes some time to assimilate. And we don't have, all the answers to the obvious questions that come up. We're technical building and design professionals. We don't know who's responsible for these explosives. We don't have the capability to research that. We can't force witnesses to come forward and testify. We don't have those powers. We need a real criminal investigation, obviously. We support that. We support investigative journalists doing their job. And some of them are, and most of them aren't. But you can pressure them, and that's what we're talking about. One thing you can do is read yourself our 50-page booklet and send it to them so that they can read it. Send it to every architect and engineer you can find. You can actually download the PDF for free, or you can order the hard copy right on our website at AE911Truth.org. You can go right on the webinar page of the website and download this for free right now. And right now, I want you to be really aware that we've made a landmark DVD with 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out this evidence, along with 8 psychologists that actually support us in understanding why this information can be so difficult for most people to accept, and how to assist them and ourselves in working with this new information. But here's the 2-minute trailer that you can get a sense of the film.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. I know that there are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA and Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-gray crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined, and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. And the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
And indeed, you can organize a screening right in your own living room of this film, which you can show the 1-hour version of and watch for free on YouTube. Just Google Experts Speak Out. And you can get the 90-minute film, which shows a lot more information on our website. And the latest film we made is called Firefighters, Architects, Engineers Expose 9/11 Myths. We have just completed a nationwide and Europe-wide tour showing this film, and it's received a lot of praise for its content, specifically for Eric Lawyer's single presentation on this subject of 9/11, a firefighter who organized firefighters for 9/11 Truth and Unity with 200 firefighters calling for a new investigation. So that film, you can simply search on Google, Expose 9/11 Myths. Comes right up, 1-hour version. And again, the 90-minute version is available on our website. Next week, we look into the evidence of extreme heat when we do week 4, next Thursday. Pyroclastic-like clouds, molten steel and iron microspheres, thermite, which is evidence of cutter charges, nanothermite also. Very, very, very important evidence, also overlooked by NIST. At this time, I'm sure we have some questions. How about it, Andy?
Sure. Our first question asks, how did the government try to invalidate all the people talking about explosions that you played when you bring it up to them?
Well, that's interesting. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think what they're asking is you played the montage of people talking about explosions on the morning of 9/11. So what does the government, how does the government respond to that?
Well, the most typical response that we've heard from NIST, who's the spokesperson and the agency tasked by Congress to explain the destruction of these towers, they say, well, a building collapsing can be confused with explosions, and there's really quite a difference. And you yourselves heard dozens of these 156 witnesses, and you can read the rest and you certainly get a feeling. Last week, in fact, we showed with Building 7 a very clear explosion in the afternoon of 9/11 from downtown on the World Trade Center site, and it's incredible, loud, large. And these people were being blown around inside these buildings before they collapsed. That's extremely important, relevant, and direct evidence of explosive, not a building collapsing.
Okay, our next question asks, how fast do you estimate it would take to prep the two towers for demolition if your hypothesis is true?
Well, these are the three most advanced and largest controlled demolitions in history. What we know about smaller controlled demolitions are that they take months to engineer and place these explosives. They take dozens of people. So we're looking at a very sophisticated operation that would have to have access inside the towers months before 9/11. This is not happening on the day of 9/11. This is happening. This is a setup, which is one of the key critical planned components of a much larger operation. So we want an investigation relative to the Twin Towers of ACE Elevator, for instance, who had access to the core columns and beams through the elevator shafts the 9 months prior to 9/11 in what was billed as the largest elevator modernization in history by Elevator World in their magazine article of March 2001, just 6 months prior to 9/11. And ACE Elevator, in fact, had 85 employees in the building. And this was documented by USA Today in October, that they fled. These are experts in the delivery of the victims and helping the firefighters. The elevator cabs are the key means of getting a lot of these victims out of these towers, but they fled. They didn't stick around to help the firefighters. It was quite a scandal, as a matter of fact, and they had their justifications. But interestingly, also, ACE Elevator seemed to come out of nowhere to achieve the maintenance the maintenance contract from Otis Elevator after the bombings. The bombing in the tower happened in 93 or 95, and Otis Elevator was the largest elevator company in the world, and ACE came out of nowhere and began to take over this contract. So anyway, we certainly want an investigation of them, and there are people who are working on this research, and if anybody knows additional information, we encourage you to send it to us in our contact us form at AE911Truth.org. We also want an investigation, of course, of the security company who had the security contract for these buildings. and under whose noses would have had to have been brought many, many tons of very high-tech, sophisticated thermite, nanothermite, as we'll see next week, and probably high-energy explosives as well.
Okay, our next question asks, where does the fact that the antenna on the North Tower fell first fit into NIST's analysis?
I don't remember if NIST particularly acknowledged the split that like a half a second prior to the collapse of the North Tower. The antenna does begin to fall first. Now, what that does indicate is that core columns were damaged first, and that does conflict with NIST's theory that the floors sagged and pulled in the perimeter columns, setting up this gravitational collapse of the top 15 floors in the case of the North Tower, because the antenna falling indicates the collapse of the hat structure, the hat truss, which is supported by the core columns. So those core columns must have given way first. Now, that's our theory as to how the perimeter columns were pulled in too, by the way. So if, in fact, the core columns were compromised, that would allow or give cause for the antenna to fall first. It would also give cause for those lightweight floor trusses to be pulled inward, to be pulling the perimeter columns inward as they were pulled downward on the inside by the core columns that were compromised. So that is the theory of the architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, directly consistent with the evidence we see, particularly with this North Tower, and pulls the rug out from underneath NIST's initiation of collapse theory. And by the way, their entire investigation stopped at the initiation of collapse. There is no investigation whatsoever after, by their own admission. In fact, I quote, after conditions were set for the initiation of collapse, and then they say collapse became inevitable. They say, well, you can just see it on the videos. It came down essentially at free fall. You know, structural engineers do this every day for a living, analyze the capability of an intact, cold, hard structure below to resist any given weight, collapsing weight above.
Okay, our last question today asks, if this were a natural collapse instead of a demolition, why would the concrete turn to dust in midair?
Yeah, well, this is clearly our question too. We would expect a stack of 110 floors, certainly broken up concrete at the bottom of a collapsing 110-story building. We would also expect, by the way, the steel spire in the case, I forget which tower it is. I think it's it's clearly the North Tower. The steel spire, which remains a few seconds in the videos after the collapse of this building, and then it collapses. Well, we would expect that steel spire to have been crushed by the 15-story section, which they say drove intact, drove the rest of the building down to the ground and then destroyed itself. Well, if that's true, how can there be a steel spire still there? Clearly, that's not what happened. Clearly, their whole theory is shot by that evidence alone, along with all the other evidence we've been looking at.
Okay, well, that is it for the questions for today. We want to invite everybody back next week for the following webinar. It'll be the fourth part in this series before they start again. These happen every Thursday at 1 o'clock, so tune in. And of course, if you are unable to watch that live, you can always watch it at the same site, AE911Truth.org/webinar. and watch the archive and certainly pass it around to others who may be interested in this issue.
Absolutely. And there's so much you can do, and I encourage everybody to do something as you're digesting the implications of this devastating material. So we'll look at the incendiary evidence next week. Until then, thanks everybody, and thanks Andy for all the help, and we'll see everybody next week. 1 o'clock Pacific, 4 o'clock Eastern. Bye now.